Hello, my name is Mariana Kortz and I'm a senior elementary education major. In ETE 310, my class and I are preparing to take the ETPA, and in order to do this, we are creating blogs full of videos to support ourselves as we are preparing for this test. The first of these videos will be talking about academic language. And in order to discuss this, I have looked at several videos and also the ETPA handbook. First of all, academic language are various aspects within a content area that help a student show their knowledge about that subject. And that does not simply include the vocabulary, as we will learn later. Another interesting fact is that academic language is oral and written. Oftentimes, when we think of academic language, we simply think of what is written on the board, as students will be writing those words and maybe even putting it in a vocabulary journal. But academic language also includes the oral parts of language, how students are discussing with each other and other facts in that area. There are different aspects of academic language, and there are language demands, language functions, vocabulary, discourse, syntax, and language supports. In this video, I'm going to highlight a few of these, but they are all extremely important. The first one that I will highlight is discourse. Discourse is written and oral. And the important thing with discourse is that students must know how to use the language of school. Oftentimes you have a student who comes from a family who speaks non-standard English. Maybe they spell words differently than their classmates. And as a teacher, we must decide how to support those students in our classroom. And that is through explicit lessons teaching academic language. And that is the part of that is discourse is written and oral. I was able to see how to teach discourse at Harrison. I had a group of students who really needed help with writing. They would read a section about, say, the pioneers, but they wouldn't know how to start answering a prompt. And so my cooperating teacher and I provided them with sentence starters. For example, one day we were completing a Venn diagram, and I asked them to compare their lives to the lives of the pioneers. During our lesson, the students were able to fill out the Venn diagram, but were unable to figure out how to take that knowledge and use it to create comparison statements. And so throughout my semester, I learned how to help students in that area by providing sentence starters. The other fact that I will highlight in this area is syntax, and that is how something is organized. This part of academic language is often extremely hard to teach because if someone is comfortable with an area, they may not know what it's like to be confused. For instance, I am not as comfortable in math, and oftentimes people who are very competent in math know how to create formulas from statements. But I need to be taught the syntax of math, how to create formulas based on looking at a graph and other things in that area. In order to support your students in syntax, you must explicitly teach those forms, or you'll have a student who does not know how to respond to a prompt. Also, there are language supports, which is how the teacher supports their students. The other focuses of academic language can be supported by the other students, but this one is simply with the teacher. How can the teacher help the students learn academic language? For example, when I was in my sophomore year in college, I was teaching a lesson about habitats. And to support my students, I chose to pre-teach the vocabulary about each biome because I knew that some of my students might not know the actual names of, say, a tundra and other words that they might not have seen in multiple contexts. Along with reading the EdTPA handbook, we also watched several videos. One of them was Pass EdTPA, and that also included information about academic language. So one thing that I'd like to highlight in this area is that language function is the verb in the central focus. This was one topic that was not discussed in the EdTPA handbook. When someone is writing an EdTPA lesson, they must include a central focus. And how I think of it is central focuses seem very similar to content and language objectives that are used in your typical lesson plan. And I will have an example of a central focus later in this video. Also, there are language demands, which is how the student shows their understanding. This is the words that they use in writing or in speech to show that they understand. And this is very important as well. I'm going to move on to my example of a central focus. From the video had an example for a science lesson, and it said, students analyze characteristics of atom particles. But as I was reviewing some of my previous lesson plans, I found that one of my objectives would be a very good central focus because it included a verb similar to the verb found in the science central focus, and it also included what the students must specifically explain or what they must show. So my possible central focus is that the student will be able to write a sentence using first, second, or third person. I believe this would be a good central focus as it has that verb, which is the word write. And it also says what the students must write, which is a sentence using first, second, or third person. Scrolling on, their example of language demand. They had several examples. One of them was that the students could list words by writing on paper. And as I previewed some of my previous lessons, I found one possible language objective that might fulfill a language demand, which was the students will be able to verbally explain whether a quote is written in first, second, or third person, and their reasoning behind their choice. I believe that this would be an adequate language demand as it talks about specifically how the students would show their answer, and that would be verbally. They must use their speech in order to show their understanding. In the example I gave before, it says they must write on paper, which is the specific action. All right, next, moving on. Another one that was spoken in the EdTPA handbook is one of the aspects of academic language is discourse. And as I was perusing through my lessons, I found an example of discourse. In one of my lessons that I wrote last year, I included information about the pioneers. And in my lesson, the students read a packet aloud as a group, and then they went and individually filled out Venn diagrams comparing their lives to the lives of the pioneers. And I believe that this lesson showed discourse very well because it included writing as the students filled out the Venn diagram and speaking as they read it out loud and they heard those auditory words to help them understand what was being read. Next is vocabulary. The main way that I showed that in my first Pioneer lesson was by having vocabulary stations. Each station had a picture of the vocabulary word, either an object, for example, buckskin. I had a picture of a buckskin coat. Or it had words to help the students analyze what could be the vocabulary word. And so my lesson really showed vocabulary because not only was I pre-teaching them, but I was helping my students become curious about what the word was. I wasn't specifically saying what each vocabulary word was at the beginning of my lesson. All right, moving on. The next fact that I found very important is that academic language is often used to make abstract ideas very concrete. And one example that I found of this throughout my education is in math, if you have a negative number. You may think in your head about negative numbers, especially if you understand subtraction, how if you take something away, that's minus something, so minus 5. Example could be 10 minus 5. But you can't exactly understand the concept or visualize it until you use symbols, which is one form of academic language. So if I wrote -5 on the board, then my students would understand more concretely what -5 was. I could even draw a picture of -5. And if I do it in such a way, that could be considered academic language. And finally, the dimensions of academic language. Academic language includes vocabulary, syntax, and discourse. It is not simply vocabulary, as I stated before. Oftentimes we don't think of that syntax, that structure, or discourse, or oral or written discourse as being part of academic language. But all three of those include academic language.